Hello, fellow anti-novelists and Lilligans and friends and curious onlookers. Welcome. So I'm continuing along on my developmental edit, and I hit a little bit of a speed bump that I thought it might be a good idea to share it with you in case you're writing along and you realize, ooh, I need something over here, so I'm going to have to go back over here and make all that happen. So you're looking at a printout of the first 100 pages of my novel. This is all pretty well locked in stone. Everything's good. It's past edits. And so I'm continuing on through the process. The reason I have this is because if we go back here to chapter 22, which is tentatively labeled Home, this is when, after being in Kansas City, my main male character, Marshall Branch, goes back to his ranch in Oklahoma. So therefore he is home. When he gets there, he has a critical, revealing conversation with his longtime friend and ranch manager, Jet. Well, the reason that became important as part of my developmental editing process is because I have not fully fleshed out Jet's backstory. So you may find in the process of working on your story that you've got characters who you know are going to be significant, but in the interest of getting through the first right of the story, you kind of gloss over them with the intention that you know you'll come back later as the story's events have unfolded. You're going back to the beginning, and then you're going to start filling in those other pieces. So story development is always a back and forth exercise. Okay. So if you think that you just sit down with your idea, all your characters fully formed, and just right through to the end of the story, then you are a better woman than I am, because I don't write that way. I tend to write in circles within circles. So I've got the rough structure of the story, the major plot points. I pretty much know what the major plot beats are. I know who my main character arc point of view characters are. But then my more minor, or I shouldn't say minor, my less vocal, less visible, less main characters, those are sometimes just left to be developed depending on what the story needs from them. So that's how Jet has evolved. So let's go into my Keep On Going journal, which is the one where I have 1-page spread labeled for each chapter. So you can see here that I've turned to chapter 22, which has my developmental editing notes for chapter 22. So this all began during a drive to Wichita, Kansas to see Blake Shelton last weekend, which is about a 3-hour drive. So we're cruising along, and like I do, I'm chit-chatting with my own cowboy about some elements of the story that I was ready to start working on. One of them being our ranch manager, Jet. So he is introduced early on in the story when he brings out Rango, his horse, and discovers that there's been kind of a disaster at the ranch. I'll just leave it at that. So as I started thinking him through, I really needed to dial in those specific details about him so that he now has his story developing as I'm doing the developmental edits and continuing the second and third drafts of writing. So he started out on this very messy page. I only had a few note cards with me, so I thought, well, I'm just going to draft out my notes about him, and then I can go back and do my actual character development cards later. So we decided that he's from a logging town. He grew up very rough. He didn't come from a good family, and he left home as soon as he was able to leave home. So he's from Black Forks, Utah, which is actually an 1800s era logging town. I just thought Black's Fork? What's not to like about that? So what does he love? He loves working hard. He loves horses. He hates laziness. He hates sitting still. And he's done all kinds of crazy jobs, which that will be important later because all of his crazy jobs will at some point come in handy. Ooh, hey, I know how to do that. People are like, how do you know how to do that? Well, let me tell you about this job I had once. So makes for a good kind of flashback or just one of those fun little cowboy characteristics, sitting around telling stories like you do. So I broke down a little bit about his age. I couldn't decide how old I wanted him to be. So on my little note card, I just sketched it out. My story year is 2019. I decided he's about 64. So doing a little quick maths, he was born in 1955. So I've made myself a little checkbox with a note, add to timeline, right? Because I have my great big timeline that folds out that I keep all of my notes about my characters and events on. So I'll need to go back to 1955 and add that's when Jet was born. So that when I look at the big high level picture of my story on the timeline, I can see him in relation to everything else during that time. So in 1970, he was 15 years old, and that's when he left home, struck out on his own. Then I have a note. The accident defines him. Who did he kill? Ooh, maybe a spoiler there. And there's a blank to fill in, and why, and there's a blank to fill in. So that's where I start thinking through, what is his character's wound? What has happened in his past that informs who he is today and why he is so loyal and supportive of Branch and the things that happen around the ranch? So sometimes you get bits of dialogue, and I went over this in an earlier video where I talk about how in my Zettelkasten I have specific places where I store dialogue, bits of conversation, anything that I think might be used later. Well, one of those dialogue cards has the quote on it, "This is your home." I didn't know where I was going to use that, didn't know why it would be important. However, as I was fleshing out Jet's backstory, I had the aha moment. Jet ran from something in his young past. He was essentially labeled a screw-up, a runaway, a bad guy, and he ended up on the ranch with Branch. Branch showed him kindness. He didn't judge him. He gave him work to do, and he gave him trust. Those critical things are what have led to Jet being such a loyal, lifelong friend. So you can see how all of those details start to gel together to build his story and develop his character arc. So I've started my first Zettelkasten card. I've decided his name is Jefferson D. Cox, and he goes by Jet. That will be revealed later as to why that's his nickname. He's the ranch manager at the Diamond B Ranch. His date of birth, I haven't chosen the date yet, but it's 1955, and I've added that checkbox that tells me to add that to my timeline. So that's just my first card that gets his story going. So now let's look at one final piece, which is what got me thinking about all this in the first place. So I have early on, like I said, he gets introduced very early on in the story, but not super developed until we get up to those 20-something chapters. So what I notice when I get up there is in somewhere in chapters numbered 50-ish, Jet needs to step up. And I have a note on my plot tracker that says Jet steps up with the horses and tea with Rango, which is his horse. So he's going to do something that plays a critical role in the story, and it's going to happen right around here, which is why at this point in the writing, I needed to hightail it back over to my Zettelkasten and start creating those character cards and build out his backstory so that it suits what's needed in the story. That's the second advantage to waiting to do some of that character backstory or character development until you get a little further into your story. Because sometimes you don't know what critical elements are needed from a character until you start doing the writing. And then you think, ooh, I need somebody here in these 50-something chapters who can play this role and do this thing. Aha, that's going to be Jet. So you start doing the writing and you plug it in. So with that said, that's all I have to show you out of this little bit of writing. So that's a high-level look at how sometimes you're going through that writing process, you're doing those continuity edits, and you're thinking, ooh, now I need to develop this and flesh that out into the story so that it all gels together. So I hope that was helpful. I am still smack in the middle of developmental edits. Whoo doggy, does it take a long time, but it is so worth it because I'm identifying plot holes, I'm finding threads that need to be pulled through, and I'm coming up with new, exciting, and fun ways to tie my story together and make sure that the whole thing is one solid, satisfying unit. With all that said, the final note is, you may remember when I was talking about plotting, early on, you make some kind of offering to your readers. You offer this kind of story with these kinds of features. Then, in the middle of the story, you are making discoveries, and reaching milestones. That's where I am now. I'm in the part of the story for the reader where I'm making discoveries and reaching milestones. And that included fleshing out Jet's character so he could serve his purpose. That will bring me to the end of the story, which is the settlement or the finale, where I settle everything up for my reader. So make sure you're watching those key points so that you know you're doing what you need to do to be solid for your reader, and that as you're going through your story, you're pulling through those threads and characters that need further development in order to tie the whole thing up. So keep editing, keep writing, I said writing. And keep in mind what I always say, which is get those notes down on the page, even if it's quickly sketching them out on a sheet, if it's doing your character development cards, quickly sketching them out on a card, or just making notes on your plot tracker. Wherever those notes go, get it on the page because it won't stay in your head forever. And those little bits of writing are the things that you'll use to fill out your development later. So I hope this was helpful. I will keep doing my editing. You keep doing your writing, and I'll see you in the next video.